The hallway of Linden Elementary School smelled like wet boots and old paper. It was a Tuesday in October, gray outside. The kind of morning that made everything feel slightly heavier than it should. Ethan Brooks was standing near the front office when it happened. He had been waiting the way he always waited, with the quiet patience of a man who had learned to make himself small. He was 34, broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket that had been expensive once. His jaw was set. His eyes tracked his daughter the way a lighthouse tracks the water. Steady, constant, never quite resting. Emma was 7 years old and had her mother's eyes, which meant Ethan could never look at her for too long without something pressing against the back of his throat. She had walked up to the front desk and asked, politely, in that careful way she always spoke to strangers, whether Mrs. Calloway had graded her science project yet. The woman behind the desk, mid-40s, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, did not look up from her monitor. Emma stood there. She asked again. The woman turned a page. Ethan moved before he thought about it. He stepped forward, stood at the desk, and said quietly, the way people say things when they are trying very hard not to shout, "Don't talk to my daughter like she doesn't exist." The hallway went still. 2 teachers paused mid-conversation. A parent looked up from her phone. A custodian with a mop handle stopped walking, because the woman at the desk was not just any school administrator. Victoria Hale had donated the new gymnasium. She had funded the reading program that supplied every classroom with fresh books each semester. She owned 11 buildings within 4 miles of where they were standing. The mayor had mentioned her name in his last 3 press conferences. She was not someone people spoke to that way. Ethan didn't know any of this yet. He only knew his daughter was still standing there, chin up, waiting to be seen. Victoria Hale removed her reading glasses. She looked at Emma, not at Ethan, not at the room, but at the child, standing in front of her, and she was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to make 3 people in that hallway hold their breath. Then she said 5 words. "He's right." Apologized to her. The sound of the hallway returning to normal came slowly, like air filling a room after a window is opened. Nobody who was there that morning would forget it. Ethan thought he had just made the worst mistake of his adult life. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about a lot of things. 2 months before that morning in the hallway, Ethan Brooks had $312 in his checking account and a 7-year-old asleep in the back seat of a 2014 Civic with a cracked dashboard and a heater that took 11 minutes to warm up properly. Claire had died 14 months earlier. Pancreatic cancer. Fast, as these things sometimes are, they had 8 weeks between the diagnosis and the end, which was enough time to say everything important and still not feel like enough. Emma had been 5 when it happened. She remembered her mother the way young children remember things in textures rather than details. The smell of her shampoo, the way she hummed while washing dishes, the weight of her hand. Ethan had managed. That was the most accurate word for it. He had managed, which meant he had not drowned, which was a different thing entirely from being fine. He had juggled 3 part-time jobs for a year, warehouse shifts, a weekend gig delivering medical supplies, occasional handyman work through an app that paid per job. He had kept Emma fed, enrolled, clothed. He had kept the Civic insured and running. He had kept going. But manage is a word that implies a kind of sustainability, and by October of that year, the structure was beginning to buckle under its own weight. Emma needed stability. She needed one school, not the threat of a mid-year move every time rent became a question. She needed a father who was home in the evenings, not punching in somewhere across the city while a neighbor's teenage daughter supervised homework. Ethan needed a real job. He had applied to 43 of them. The recruiter's text came on a Wednesday evening while he was heating soup on a single-burner hot plate in a kitchen the size of a large closet. Private driver position. Long-term. Salary $78,000 annually plus benefits. Immediate start. Discretion required. He stared at the number. He thought, "This is not real." He called anyway. The man who answered was named Lucas Grant. His voice had the particular quality of someone who spent a great deal of time managing other people's logistics. Efficient, pleasant, careful with information. He explained that the position was full-time, that the employer valued privacy above most other things, that the specific responsibilities would be discussed in person. "Is there something wrong with the job?" Ethan asked. "It's been posted for 6 weeks. A pause. "The employer has specific requirements. Not everyone is comfortable with them." "What kind of requirements?" "She prefers not to converse during transit. She has irregular hours, and she requires absolute discretion regarding her destinations and schedule." "That's it?" "Previous candidates found it difficult," Lucas said carefully, "to maintain professional boundaries over time." Ethan thought about his situation for approximately 4 seconds. "I can start Monday." Hale Tower was a 40-story glass building in the financial corridor of Grayford, a mid-sized city that had rebuilt itself over the past 2 decades from a faded industrial base into something that resembled, at least from certain angles, prosperity. The lobby had floor-to-ceiling windows and a security desk staffed by men in dark suits. The building directory listed 12 companies on various floors, all subsidiaries of Hale Properties Group. Lucas met him in the parking garage at 7:15 on a Monday morning. He handed Ethan a laminated card with the vehicle code, the building access sequence, and a brief set of protocols. He said, "The vehicle is always ready by 6:50. The employer's schedule changes without notice. You do not ask where you are going, she will tell you, or she won't, and both are acceptable. You do not speak unless she speaks first. You do not mention her name outside of professional communications." Ethan read the card. "She sounds like she's been disappointed before," he said. Lucas looked at him steadily. "She has been disappointed by almost everything," he said, without any particular judgment in it. "That's why the position is still open." Victoria Hale came down from the elevator at 7:42, which was 3 minutes earlier than Lucas had told him to expect. Ethan had been waiting outside the town car, a black Lincoln, immaculate, smelling faintly of cedar and something else he couldn't identify, and he saw her cross the garage floor and understood, in a single, wordless moment, why 11 drivers had quit. She was not intimidating in the way powerful people were usually intimidating. She wasn't loud. She didn't project authority the way some executives did, with the ostentatious energy of people who needed you to know they mattered. She was tall, early 50s, dark coat, her dark hair threaded with silver, pulled back from a face that was composed in the way that only comes from long practice. She moved like someone who had decided, at some point, that the world would simply have to keep up. She got into the back of the car without a word. Ethan closed the door and got in the front. He drove. 22 minutes. 3 turns, 1 traffic light, the on-ramp to the elevated road, and then the service entrance of Grayford Children's Medical Center. She was out of the car before he'd fully stopped. She walked through a side door that opened when she pressed her badge, and she did not look back. He sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes. Then she came back. He drove her to the tower. She went upstairs. The day was over for him at 4:15. He had not said a single word. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them. Victoria's destinations varied, but her manner did not. She went to places that surprised him, not the restaurants and functions he had expected of someone in her position, but the edges of the city. A community center in the Haverford district that served hot meals on Tuesday nights. A building site in Eastwick where a low-income housing development was going up. A library on Morrow Street that was fighting a budget cut with a petition campaign and donated books, she observed. She spoke to people, occasionally short, factual exchanges, and then she was done. She never explained herself. Ethan didn't ask. He was better at silence than he'd realized. Grief had taught him that. After Claire died, he had spent long stretches of evenings in rooms where saying anything felt like a violation of something true. Silence wasn't emptiness. It could be a kind of respect. So he drove, and he was quiet, and the weeks passed. He was not unhappy. This surprised him. his childcare arrangement broke on a Thursday in late October. The woman who watched Emma after school, Mrs. Paulette Dennis, a retired teacher 2 floors down from their apartment, had a family emergency in Albany and needed to leave by noon. She called him at 11:50. His shift ran until 5. He called Lucas and explained the situation, speaking quickly, already drafting his apology in his head. Lucas put him on hold for 90 seconds. When he came back, he said, "Miss, Hale has no objection. She doesn't even know my daughter. She's aware of the situation. Bring her." So Emma came. She was small for her age, people always said so, and Emma always made the same, precise, unimpressed face in response, and she climbed into the back seat of the Lincoln with her backpack and her notebook, the spiral-bound kind with the purple cover she carried everywhere, and she sat with the deliberate seriousness of a child who understood that this was a working situation and she was a guest in it. Victoria arrived at the car, opened the door, and found a 7-year-old already positioned on the far end of the back seat, drawing something with a chewed-up pencil. There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. Victoria got in. Emma did not say anything. Victoria did not say anything. Ethan, who had been preparing to explain and apologize and negotiate all at once, found that there was nothing to explain. He drove. Emma drew for the entire 40-minute trip. She drew the way some children read, fully absorbed, occasionally tilting her head, erasing and redrawing with the focused patience of someone who cared deeply about accuracy. She drew houses, mostly. Houses with lighted windows and wide porches and trees in front. Houses that looked the way the word home was supposed to sound. Victoria glanced at the notebook, once, and then again. She said nothing. They arrived at the Haverford Community Center. Victoria got out. Emma watched her walk away through the window and said, without looking up from her drawing, "She's sad." Ethan looked at his daughter in the rearview mirror. "Don't say that to her." "I didn't say it to her," Emma said reasonably. "I said it to you." The following Thursday, Mrs. Dennis had a doctor's appointment. Emma came again. This time, 3 minutes into the drive, Emma looked up from her notebook and said, "Do you like to draw?" Victoria was looking out the window. She did not turn. A long moment. "I used to," she said. It was the first full sentence Ethan had heard her speak that wasn't logistical. Emma nodded, as though this were a satisfying answer, and went back to her drawing. Victoria continued to look out the window, but something in the set of her shoulders had changed. By the end of November, Emma had joined them on 6 separate occasions. She drew the same things, variations of the same theme. Houses, neighborhoods, green spaces, children playing, windows lit from within. She had started drawing a figure she identified, without being asked, as the tall woman. The figure stood at the edge of scenes, looking in, not excluded, simply watching, as if deciding whether she was allowed to belong. Victoria began looking at each drawing when Emma finished, not commenting, just looking. The way you look at something that means more than it should. She took none of them. Emma didn't offer. Some things need more time to be ready. Which brings us back to a Tuesday morning in early December, and the hallway of Linden Elementary School, and the woman at the front desk who was looking at her monitor instead of at a child who was trying very hard to be polite. Victoria had needed to stop at the school to deliver a check for the winter reading program she donated to it annually. Though she had never visited in person, Lucas had told Ethan to pull into the school lot rather than waiting on the street. Ethan had taken Emma inside while Victoria finished a call. He was standing 6 feet away when it happened. Emma stood at the desk, her voice clear and measured, asking a specific, reasonable question about her science project. The woman behind the desk, whose nameplate read Patricia Chen, was handling 3 things at once and had developed the particular habit of administrative multitasking, in which certain people, small, quiet, unaccompanied, simply did not register as demanding immediate attention. Emma asked twice. Ethan counted. On the 3rd time, he stepped forward. He wasn't shouting. He was very deliberate about not shouting. He was speaking quietly and directly, and with the particular clarity of a man who had spent his daughter's entire life working to ensure she knew she was worth being heard. "Don't talk to my daughter like she doesn't exist." The hallway went tight. Patricia Chen looked up. The two teachers nearby went still. A parent coming in through the main door paused with his hand on the glass, and then Victoria Hale walked in. She had heard it through the entrance door. She had heard the way people hear things they weren't supposed to hear clearly, entirely, with the full weight of the context landing at once. She looked at Emma, then at Patricia Chen, then at Ethan, briefly, with an expression he couldn't read. She said, "He's right." Apologized to her. It was not a suggestion. It was not harsh. It was simply the way things were going to be. Patricia Chen apologized. Emma received it with the quiet dignity of someone who had been waiting for it, but had not been sure it would come. They walked out to the parking lot together, Ethan, Emma, and Victoria, and nobody said anything for the first 20 steps. Then Emma stopped and looked up at Victoria. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," Victoria said. "Most adults don't." Victoria looked at her for a long moment. "I know," she said again. "I used to be better at it." Emma seemed to consider this answer. Then she nodded and got into the car. Ethan stood by the driver's door. He looked at Victoria across the roof of the Lincoln. He didn't know what to say. She got in the car, and he drove, and neither of them spoke, and it was a different kind of silence than the one they'd had before. That afternoon, their destination was the Riverside District Community Meeting. A gathering that happened every second Tuesday in a building that had been a union hall 60 years ago and was now a place where people brought folding chairs and argued about parking and sometimes organized things that mattered. Ethan sat with the car in the lot. Emma sat in the back seat. She was drawing something new. He watched her in the mirror, the particular concentration of her face, the way her tongue touched the corner of her mouth when she was working out a detail that wouldn't cooperate. "What are you making?" Emma held it up. It was a neighborhood. A whole neighborhood, rendered in the careful proportions of a child who had been paying attention to the world. There were apartment buildings, 3 of them, with rows of windows, each window a small yellow square suggesting warmth and occupancy. There was a courtyard with a tree, a swing set, a garden with inexact but clearly intentional flowers, children on the path between buildings, a woman standing near the entrance, looking at the children. "What is this place?" Ethan asked. "The Happy House," Emma said. "Is there a happy house?" Emma looked at him with the expression she reserved for questions she found surprisingly obvious. "There should be." She pointed to the woman in the drawing. "That's Miss Victoria." Ethan looked at the figure. It was drawn with the same careful specificity as everything else. The height right, the hair right, the posture right. "Does she know you draw her?" "She never looks sad when I draw her," Emma said, as though this answered everything. Victoria came back to the car 40 minutes later, her coat slightly damp from the weather that had been threatening rain all afternoon and had finally made good on its promise. She settled into the back seat, and Ethan was about to start the engine when Emma leaned forward and held out the notebook, opened to the drawing. "I made this for you." Victoria looked at it. She looked at it the way you look at something that catches you unexpectedly. Not a long look, not a studied look, but the kind that takes a half-second too long because you need a moment to decide what you feel about it. She took the page carefully, as though it was something that could be damaged. She didn't say anything at first. Then, "What's the woman doing?" "Watching the kids," Emma said. "Making sure they're okay." Victoria folded the drawing once, precisely, and placed it in the inside pocket of her coat, against her chest. She didn't explain why she put it there. She didn't need to. The Riverside apartments occupied the southern end of a block that the city had largely decided to forget. 6 buildings, 4 stories each, built in the late 1970s from the kind of optimism that believed good design could solve poverty. The design had been decent. Once, the optimism had outlasted the funding by roughly 18 months. and what remained was the structural result of 4 decades of deferred maintenance. Stairwells that smelled like mildew, hallways lit by single bulbs, elevators that operated on schedules of their own devising. 412 people lived there. In December, word had gotten out that Hale Properties was planning to acquire the site. The neighborhood had heard this kind of story before. Victoria asked Ethan to bring her there on a Wednesday morning. He pulled into the main courtyard, and she got out and stood for a moment, looking at the buildings with the calm, assessing expression she used when she was processing something complex. People noticed her immediately. Word moved through the courtyard in the particular way. Information moves in close communities quickly, quietly, with the texture of something important. A man named Gerald Whitmore, who had lived in Building 3 for 19 years and served as the unofficial spokesperson for people who had no other spokesperson, walked across the courtyard. He was in his 60s. He moved carefully, the way men move when their knees have given them reasons to be careful. He said, "Are you here to tell us we're being moved?" His voice was not hostile. It was the voice of a man who had been through enough versions of this conversation to have accepted that anger was less useful than clarity. Victoria said, "The buildings aren't safe." "We know that," Gerald said. "We've been saying that for 6 years. I know you have. But you're going to demolish them." Victoria was quiet. Around them, more people had gathered. Not crowding, standing in the way people stand when they are trying to hear something without looking like they are listening. A woman with a stroller, 2 teenagers on a low wall, an elderly man in a winter coat too thin for the weather. Emma, who had come again that day because Mrs. Dennis was still dealing with her family situation, had gotten out of the car without being asked. She stood next to Ethan, her notebook under her arm. Ethan put his hand on her shoulder. She didn't move away from it, but she was watching Victoria with that particular attention she reserved for things she was trying to understand. "You're going to knock these down," Gerald said. "Build something we can't afford and sell it at twice the market rate, and we end up somewhere worse." "That was the original plan," Victoria said. The word original landed in the courtyard and sat there. Gerald looked at her carefully. "And now?" Victoria looked at the buildings, then at the people, then at Emma. And Emma, who had not been asked, who was 7 years old and standing in a courtyard she had never visited before, opened her notebook to the drawing of the happy house. She held it up the way children hold things up when they want adults to actually see them, at eye level, steady. "This is what it should look like," Emma said. The courtyard was very quiet. Gerald Whitmore looked at the drawing. He had grandchildren. He recognized what a child's drawing meant, the faith in it, the directness. He cleared his throat. Emma said, "The kids who live here already know where their home is, so they should get to have a happy one." She said it the way she said most things, plainly, without performance, as though she was describing a fact of physics rather than making an argument. Victoria reached into her coat. She took out the folded drawing Emma had given her the day before the same scene, the same courtyard, the same woman at the entrance, watching children. She unfolded it and held it beside Emma's notebook, and the resemblance between the 2 drawings, the one from yesterday, the one from today, was unmistakable. Same architecture of hope, same proportions of possibility. She said, "No one is being displaced." Someone in the back of the gathered crowd said "what" in a voice that was barely a word. Victoria said it again, clearly, with the particular emphasis of a decision that had been made somewhere between one Tuesday morning and this Wednesday courtyard. "The buildings will be renovated. In phases. Residents will have housing during construction. When it's done, the rent structure stays the same. The community stays intact." Gerald stared at her. "That's not how this usually goes," he said. "I know. Why is it different this time?" A pause. Victoria looked at Emma, and then back at Gerald, and then at the cracked stairwell behind him and the window on the 3rd floor of Building 2, where a woman was watching with her arms folded across her chest. She said, "I had a son. His name was Oliver. He believed every child deserved a place that felt safe. A beat. I forgot that for a while. I think I've been forgetting a lot of things. Nobody in the courtyard said anything. Ethan, standing at the edge of all of this, felt something shift in him the way tectonic things shift. Too deep and too slow to be called a feeling in the moment. But real. Emma put her notebook back under her arm. "Oliver sounds nice," she said. Victoria's voice, when she answered, was composed. But it took a moment. "He was," she said. "He really was." The Riverside renovation was announced formally in January. It took the city by surprise, not the plan itself, which was logistically straightforward, but the fact that it had originated from Hale Properties, which had a reputation for development that prioritized yield over community. There were skeptical opinion pieces. There were city council questions. There were people who assumed there was something hidden in the terms. There wasn't. Ethan knew this because he drove Victoria to 17 different meetings over the following 6 weeks. Architects, engineers, community liaison sessions, conversations with the Riverside Tenants Association, a meeting with the City Housing Authority that ran 3 hours over schedule. She sat through all of it with the same composed focus, and she made decisions that were practical rather than theatrical, and she did not appear to be performing generosity. She was just doing it. He drove. He observed. He said very little. Emma had started drawing the Riverside project in detail. She drew the swing set. She thought they should build an ambitious one, with 4 different stations and a climbing wall she had seen at a park in another neighborhood and believed to be the superior model. She drew what the garden could look like. She drew the mural she thought should go on the side of Building 1, which was the largest blank wall and had the best southern exposure. The children of Riverside, through some process of kid-to-kid communication that operated entirely outside adult awareness, had decided that Emma was the person to consult about the future appearance of their home. They sought her out in the courtyard when Victoria held community sessions. They pointed at walls and said, "What should go there?" They argued over her designs with the passionate investment of people who had been told their opinion mattered and were not entirely sure whether to believe it yet. Emma took all of this very seriously. Victoria watched it happen from a distance, and Ethan watched Victoria watch it. And something was accumulating between all of them that didn't have a name yet. One afternoon in February, they drove to the Grayford River overlook after a long day of meetings. Victoria hadn't asked to go there. She had simply said drive, and Ethan had driven and ended up at the overlook because it was February, and the light over the water was doing something specific and good, and he wasn't ready to take her back to the tower yet. She didn't object. They sat him in the front, her in the back. Emma sleeping on the far seat with her notebook open across her chest and looked at the river. Victoria said, "Oliver was 4 when he died." Ethan was very still. "A car accident." He wasn't in the car. He was on his bicycle, coming down the front path of our house, and a car came through the gate. A pause. It was 12 years ago. He didn't say he was sorry. She had heard that enough times that the phrase had been worn down to nothing. He said, "What was he like?" She looked at the river. "He drew," she said. "He drew everything, every surface he could find. I kept finding pencil marks on the walls for 2 years after. I never painted over them." Ethan thought about Emma's drawings taped to the inside of the kitchen cabinet door, about the purple notebook that had gone through 3 iterations because she filled them completely. He said, "I understand that. I know you do," Victoria said. "That's partly why I let her keep coming." She looked at Emma sleeping. She reminded me of something I'd been trying not to remember. "Has it hurt?" A long pause. "Less than forgetting did," she said. The Riverside apartments reopened in phases across the following spring and summer. Building 1 came first, the one Emma had designated for the mural. A local artist named Bridget Farrow, who had grown up 3 blocks away and now taught visual arts at the community college, translated Emma's design into something large enough to be seen from the road. A neighborhood of lighted windows, a courtyard with a tree, children in motion. a woman standing at the entrance watching over all of it. When the scaffolding came down on the mural, Gerald Whitmore stood in the courtyard for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, to no one in particular, "That's right. That's exactly right." The swing set was built to Emma's specifications, with the climbing wall. The garden went in along the south wall of Building 3. The formal reopening happened on a Saturday in October, 1 year after the morning in the elementary school hallway. The deputy mayor was there, a city council member, representatives from the Housing Authority, and 2 non-profit organizations that had partnered on the project. Journalists, photographers. Victoria had not wanted a ceremony. She had agreed to one because Gerald Whitmore had asked her, and because the residents had planned it themselves, and there was a difference between the kind of ceremony that was about you and the kind that was about a community deciding to mark its own survival. Emma stood on the temporary stage in her good coat, navy blue, bought specifically for the occasion, slightly too large because Ethan had bought it with room to grow into, and held a framed copy of her original drawing of the Happy House. Victoria stood beside her and lifted the frame and said, "Into the microphone," with the careful steadiness of someone who had practiced this, because they knew they might otherwise not be able to say it. "This community exists because of the people who live here, who fought for it, and who refused to accept that things couldn't be different. And it exists because a 7-year-old showed me a drawing and said simply, without apology, this is what it should look like." Emma, who had been told there would be a microphone moment and had been dreading it, did not speak. She held the frame up so the people in the courtyard could see it. The applause started from the back, from the residents, from Gerald and his wife, from the woman on the 3rd floor of Building 2 who had been watching with her arms crossed that first morning and was now watching with her arms open. The drawing was hung in the main community hall, right at the entrance, at a child's eye level. Things settled. Not all at once, things rarely settle all at once. But by November, Ethan's life had a shape to it that he hadn't felt in a long time. He drove Victoria 4 days a week. He was home by 5:30 most evenings. Emma had the same school, the same bedroom, the same neighbor who now watched her not out of obligation, but out of genuine fondness. The Civic had been replaced through a practical, somewhat awkward negotiation with Lucas about the appropriate vehicle for a long-term personal driver with a car that heated up in under 3 minutes. He had stopped counting the money in his account every time he opened the app. This was progress. Victoria had started working differently. Not less, she still worked with the same thorough intensity that had built everything she owned. But she had started going to Riverside, not as an owner checking on an investment, but the way you go to a place that has become part of your life. She attended the Tuesday community dinners twice a month. She had a conversation with Bridget Farrow about a mural for the community college arts building. She sat in the garden of Building 3 on a Sunday afternoon in late October with a cup of coffee and her phone off. She had learned Emma's school schedule. This was less surprising to Ethan than it might have been 6 months earlier. In November, Emma asked Ethan one evening while he was doing dishes, "Is Miss Victoria lonely?" He looked at his daughter, who was sitting at the kitchen table with her new notebook green cover, because she had decided purple was her old phase, drawing something he couldn't see from the sink. "I think she has been," he said carefully. "I think she might be less so now." Emma nodded. "She could have dinner with us. That's a big invitation." "It is just pasta," Emma said, in the tone of a person establishing the low stakes of an offer that was actually quite high stakes. He asked. He wasn't sure she would say yes. There was a version of Victoria Hale, the version he had met in the parking garage 11 months ago, who would have found the invitation confusing and unnecessary, who would have regarded the question as a breach of professional distance. She said yes. She arrived at 6:15 with a bottle of wine she'd clearly put thought into, and a drawing book she'd found at a shop on Reed Street that had specific paper for detailed pencil work. She set the book on the table in front of Emma without comment. Emma opened it, examined the paper quality with her thumb, and said, "This is really good paper." Victoria sat down. Ethan put water on for pasta. They ate at the kitchen table that was slightly too small for 3 people, and therefore required everyone to be comfortable with proximity, which they were. Emma talked about the mural she had been asked to help design a second one on the side of a building near her school, which she considered a significant professional development. Victoria asked questions that were genuinely interested rather than politely performative. Ethan added pasta to bowls and listened to the two of them discuss the load-bearing implications of color on a large wall, and felt something in his chest that he recognized distantly as a sensation he had almost forgotten was available to him. After dinner, Emma showed Victoria her new drawings. Victoria showed Emma, on the back of a paper napkin, a rough architectural sketch she'd made at 18 that had been her first vision of what she wanted to build. Emma studied it seriously. "You were good," she said. "I had good teachers," Victoria said. "You should draw more," Emma said. "You have the hands for it." Victoria looked at her hands. "Maybe I will." Ethan washed the dishes while the two of them sat at the table and drew Emma in her new book with her technical pencils. Victoria on the napkin, then on a second one, then on a sheet of actual paper Ethan found in the printer drawer and brought over without being asked. He stood at the sink and listened to the sound of pencils on paper and Emma explaining her architectural philosophy, and Victoria laughing, actually laughing, a sound he had not heard from her before, low and brief and real. He thought about the text message from a recruiter, sent on a Wednesday evening to a man standing over a single-burner hot plate. He thought about the garage and the silence and the 22 minutes of driving to a hospital and the way a job no one else had wanted had become the thing that changed the structure of everything. He thought about Emma asleep in the back seat on a dozen different routes through a city that had looked gray and ungiving and had turned out, somehow, to be full of people trying to find their way back to something they'd lost. He thought, "I took the job because I was desperate. I drove because that was what the job required. I kept quiet because I was good at it. I raised my voice once, in a school hallway, for 45 seconds, because my daughter was standing there asking to be seen. None of it felt like strategy. All of it had led here, to this kitchen, to the sound of pencils, to three people who had all, in different ways and for different reasons, been learning to find their way back." Emma, without looking up from her drawing, said, "This is good, right?" She wasn't asking about the drawing. Ethan dried his hands on the dish towel. He looked at the table, the pasta bowls pushed to one side, the drawings spreading across the space, Victoria sketching something with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Open and unhurried. "Yeah," he said. "This is good." Emma nodded, satisfied, and went back to her drawing. Outside, November was doing what November does in Grayford. The lights coming on early, the city pulling inward toward warmth, the long year's end approaching with the steady patience of things that have waited long enough. Inside the kitchen, it was warm. It had been warm for a while now.